I want to thank Polly Patullo of Papillot Press for facilitating this event and bringing this wonderful book to our attention. And of course, I want to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Lisa Paravisini-Gebert, who's Professor of Hispanic Studies and Environmental Studies at Vassar College, where she holds the Sarah Todd Fitz Randolph Distinguished Professor Chair. She's the author and editor of many fine books, including one on Phyllis Shand Alfrey, A Caribbean Life, Jamaica Kincaid, A Critical Companion, and Creole Religions of the Caribbean with Marguerite Fernandez Ormos. But we're here today, this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever you're joining us from, to mark the publication of another collaboration published by Papillot Press in March this year, which is this wonderful book, Looting Hummingbirds, the selected poems of Daniel Talley, poet of Dominica, which Professor Paravisini-Gebert was co-editor and co-translator of with Mark Andrews. And she'll be reflecting today on this work in her presentation, which is entitled Anchored in Memory, Rediscovering Daniel Talley's West Indies, which we all very much look forward to hearing about. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks for your patience with the technical issues. I also want to thank, thank you for this opportunity to share our work on Talley and his legacy. This was, as you have mentioned, a joint project with my colleague Mark Andrews at Vassar College. And I want, first of all, to convey my deep gratitude to him for making it so much richer than it would have been had I worked alone. I'm really in awe of his persistence and dedication in gathering the elusive details of Talley's life and bringing them so vividly to the page. I also want to thank our editor, Polly Patola, who is here, for her unwavering support of this project from its conception and for all she has done to preserve the literary heritage of Dominica for generations to come. I would say that our work on Daniel Talley's legacy is really inspired by her efforts at the recovery and celebration of the island's literary and historical legacy. My first encounter with Daniel Talley's poetry came through The Orchid House, the 1953 novel by Phyllis Alfrey, the Dominican writer and politician who co-founded the Dominica Labor Party with union leader Christopher Loeblack in the early 1950s. The novel opens with a few lines from Talley's most famous poem, The Distant Island, in which he writes, "I was born on an island enamored of the wind, where the air is fragrant with sugar and vanilla, and cradled in the sun of the moving tropics by the warm blue waves of the Caribbean Sea." I was struck then by Phyllis's deep sense of kinship with a poet unknown to me, one about whom little was known and whose work could only be found in distant libraries of difficult access. For Phyllis, however, he had been a known and loved figure, and a poet who served as her own role model of what a Dominican poet could be. She would later echo Talley's deep love for his own home island in her own pen to Dominica, where she writes that love for an island is the sternest passion, pulsing beyond the blood through roots and loam. It overflows the boundaries of bedrooms and courses past the fragile walls of home. My interest in Talley's poetry grew out of that sense of kinship present in Phyllis's own writing, their shared deep love for Dominica and the challenge of expressing that love in verse. Hence this project of recovery, an effort to rescue Talley from obscurity and present his work written in French to English readers in his now English-speaking home island, and perhaps encourage a discovery of those elements of his work that were unique and worthy of continued recognition. Translation is always, as we know, less than the original, but it can serve as a bridge to understanding where language divides us. In Talley's work, with his tender attention to the birds, flora, and insects of Dominica, I found a portrait of the island as a place of wonder, a sense of Eden that his poems evoke so naturally. And in this portrait, the potential for the legacy that history so far has denied him. Daniel Talley also stands as a compelling, if often overlooked figure in Caribbean literary history. And there you go. Celebrated during his life as the Prince des Poètes antillais, written in French, escapes in spirit of Dominica, Martinique, and the broader Antilles. Yet his legacy is marked by controversy, by shifting literary tastes, and the changing politics of race and identity in the Caribbean. Born in Rosso, Dominica in 1879 to a family of distinguished Martinican and Dominican descent, Talley's early years were marked by privilege, tragedy, and displacement. After the death of both his parents and the destruction of his childhood home in the 1902 eruption of Mont Pelée, Talley pursued education in Martinique and later in Toulouse, France, where he completed his medical degree. So even before leaving for France, however, Talley had begun writing poetry, showing an early promise that would soon blossom into a prolific literary career that started in France. He published his first volume, Luciole et Cantaride, in Paris in 1900, followed by 7 other celebrated collections. His poetry was widely praised for its lyricism and evocative portrayals of Caribbean nature, memory, and nostalgia. So having spent the formative years in Toulouse and Paris, he began moving in French literary circles, reading his work at soirées, and even seeing his poetry set to music and performed at the Comédie Française. In 1908, however, Talley returned to Dominica, balancing his medical practice with his literary pursuits. He was also an amateur naturalist and folklorist, befriending the island's Kalinago community, recording aspects of their language and observing the island's flora and fauna, which would feature prominently in his poetry. But despite living quietly in Dominica, he continued to be published in France and the Caribbean to critical and popular acclaim. His best-known poem, L'Île Lointaine, became a staple in French and Caribbean schools very early on. Talley's literary productivity peaked between 1910 and 1932, during which he published eight major volumes. He was awarded the French Legion of Honor in 1925 for his contributions to literature, but after 1932, he largely withdrew from poetry, turning instead to journalism and eventually obscurity. He died in Dominica in 1950, having spent his later years in modest seclusion. Now, Talley's career and reputation were profoundly shaped by the shifting tides of Caribbean and French literary politics. In the early 1930s, as anti-colonial and Black consciousness movements gained momentum, he, once so celebrated as a poet, became the target of scathing criticism. The most significant attack came in 1932 with the publication of Légitime Défense, a historic single-issue Marxist and Surrealist journal published in Paris by a group of young Martinican intellectuals that included Etienne Leroux, René Ménil, and Jules Monnereau. The publication is widely regarded as a founding text of the Negritude movement and a watershed moment in Black anti-colonial thought. The birth of one of the most vital and significant literary movements in 20th century Caribbean literature, unfortunately, would sweep Talley away as collateral damage. In an article included in the review called Misère d'une poésie, Leroux condemned the colored bourgeoisie of the Antilles, accusing them of aspiring to whiteness and erasing their Black heritage. Talley, belonging to this class, and then one of the Francophone Caribbean most prominent literary voices, became a symbol of this alleged evasion of Black identity. The emerging Negritude movement, led by figures like Aimé Césaire, reinforced this critique, arguing that Talley's poetry, written in French, in the French tradition, and focused on nostalgia and nature, failed to address the realities of Black sufferings and resistance in the Caribbean. Talley's poetry is further criticized by its so-called doodooism, a term describing literature that exoticizes the Caribbean and its people through a colonial, often male gaze. Suzanne Césaire herself and later literary historians accused Talley of perpetuating stereotypes and ignoring the harsh social realities of post-slavery society. Jack Corzani, a very influential critic, in a 1978 study, went so far as to compare Talley's poetic treatment of Black subjects to that of a plantation owner's distant gaze. These controversies, unjust as some of these accusations might have been, diminished Talley's reputation in the decades following his death. Even if his poems remain popular in educational settings, the disappearance from collections of regional literature happened while his work was also going out of print. Despite some voices defending his artistry, Talley was often dismissed as irrelevant or complicit in colonial ideologies by the new wave of Caribbean writers and critics. Insult was added to injury in Dominica itself when Jean Rhys, having met him briefly while she visited her birthplace in 1936, subtly dismissed him by writing to a friend that there's a man called Talley who has written some poems that aren't bad. Some lines aren't bad, but he's French and colored. Despite these controversies, I would argue Talley's poetic legacy is rich, complex, and deserving of some reappraisal. His poetry is marked by a lyrical, symbolist style, blending personal nostalgia with evocative imagery of the Antillean landscape. It also captures his profound sense of loss and displacement, shaped by personal tragedy and the broader history of the Caribbean. For example, he wrote movingly of the destruction of St. Pierre, of the lush forest and wildlife of Dominica, the melancholy of exile and return, three themes that I would like to briefly highlight as central elements of a poetry that never intended to be political, but was rooted in an exploration of the tensions between presence and absence, home and exile, memory and loss. He captures the sensory experiences of Caribbean life, its sounds, scents, and colors, while also grappling with the impossibility of truly belonging to any one place. His poems are populated by birds, bees, and butterflies. There's tons of poems about insects, which I love, as symbols of both rootedness and flight, reflecting his own divided identity. But that division was not necessarily between colony and metropolis, but between Martinique and Dominica as two opposing poles, one of them lost with the destruction of the city of St. Pierre. Talley commemorated the tragedy of the destruction of St. Pierre. Move. Sorry, my PowerPoint doesn't seem to be moving. The Talley commemorated the tragedy of the destruction of St. Pierre through countless poems of mourning, whose evocation of the Antillean landscape is etched with the searing pain of the loss of so many friends when the town of St. Pierre was destroyed by the 1902 eruption of Mont Pelée. The loss of 29,000 lives within minutes of the main eruption touched Talley profoundly, as he had been for many years a student at the Lycée Saint-Pierre and lost relatives, former classmates, teachers, and lifetime friends during the eruption. He will return again and again to the eruption as a theme in his poetry, as a sort of leitmotif that permeates all his collections. But the concreteness of Talley's evocations are not limited to the destruction of St. Pierre. They form the core of a profoundly autobiographical element in his poetry, through which he often constructs a version of himself as a citizen divided between Roseau and St. Pierre, and the St. Pierre that vanished under a cloud of ash while he was away. As he writes in his two homelands, this divided identity is not rooted in Caribbean France division, but a Martinique Dominica division where one of his cardinal points has been lost. As he writes here, the town where I spent my childhood, St. Pierre, is now just a pile of ashes between black rocks. The tomb where my mother and grandmother rested, alas, I would search for it utterly in vain. I can no longer find the familiar pathways. I can no longer hear the flutes of days gone by. Dali, I would argue, could claim a rightful place as one of the Caribbean's most salient environmental poets. A keen ornithologist with a record of significant sightings and discoveries, I think of him as profoundly connected to Dominica's mountain whistler, the sifflet montagne or rufous-throated solitaire, scientifically known as Myasterides genibarvis, a unique species native to Dominica. Cherished for its distinctive melodious call, it is an integral part of the island's natural soundscape and one of the most iconic birds of Dominica's wildlife. It is the bird celebrated by Jean Rhys in Voyage in the Dark, where Anna recalls the call of the solitaire, and I quote, as one note very high up and sweet and piercing. In The Whistling Bird, another story by Jean Rhys, characters recall the bird wondering about its possible extinction. So a character says, "Oh, the whistling bird, you remember the mountain whistler? My mother called it the sifflet de montagne, le solitaire. I expect there aren't any left now." It is this preoccupation that haunts Thalys' concern about the birds of Dominica, most particularly the diablotin, the whole preoccupation with extinction. The diablotin, or black-capped petrel, is a rare and secretive petrel that spends most of its life flying over water, but it returns to land only for breeding at hidden sites, only in Hispaniola and Dominica, the only bird of its kind known to breed in the Caribbean region. But with a breeding population small and fragmented and still critically endangered, Talley wrote multiple poems about its extinction. He believed the bird to have been extinct, only to report towards the end of his life his own personal sighting of a specimen in Dominica. So one can only wonder about the epiphany of that moment for a keen ornithologist and nature lover like Talley. In Thalys' poetry, the forest emerged as symbols rooted in his deep knowledge and understanding of the centrality of forest to the ecology and biogeography of his home island, inviting us to read them eco-critically as foundational elements in his environmental awareness and imagination, an awareness that is way ahead of his time. We can best see this through his poems on the endangered presence in the forest of Dominica of the two species of endemic parrots, the Amazona imperialis, which you see here in the photo, and the Amazona arausiaca, Dominica's, through which we can tease out Thalys' understanding and identification with forest and forestry. This is such a very rich vein of new possibilities of reading his poetry. There is in Thalys' poems evidence of a number of ecological anxieties about Dominican nature, particularly the forest as habitats for birds he feared were headed for extinction, like the Cicero, the Amazona imperialis, and the Jaco, the other Dominica parrot. Talley writes of his understanding of how human predatory behavior and the desirability of Dominican parrots like the Cicero in the parrot pet trade had driven down the populations of both the solitaire and the Cicero in the forest of Dominica. He writes about poaching and the exotic bird trade as already bringing the number of Ciceros in the wild to dangerously low numbers. His poems on the parrots, I would say, recognize the toll colonization and the deforestation linked to sugar production across the region has taken on the survival of this rare, endemic, and very beautiful species, as you see here. And I value in his poetry the recognition of this history of coloniality and deforestation that has taken its toll on the birds. When he writes about the Antilles before Columbus, as a time when the parrots travel from island to island and fly so wood pigeons past each other on the sea. Uh, but I want to briefly return to his relationship with Phyllis Allfrey, mindful of time, uh, because these connections between Tali and Allfrey span family, friendships, and one thing that I'm quite interested in when it comes to Tali, literary genealogy, as she will be the only Dominican writer to date to have seen her work as a poet as following in the steps of Tali as a precursor, as following in his legacy. The two were linked through Dali's friendship with Phyllis's aunt and through his adoption of Roma Nichols, the daughter of his close friend Harold Nichols, Phyllis's uncle, whom Dali raised as his own child. Roma, in turn, became a close companion of Allfrey, and both women shared formative experiences in Dominica and later in Europe. In the late 1930s, Telly traveled with Roma to Paris, where she joined Allfrey. Their friendship is immortalized in Allfrey's poetry and prose. For example, her poem to Roma. I love the fact that both Tali and Allfrey have written poems to Roma, which celebrated Roma's beauty and spirit, while her novel The Orchid House draws on their shared Dominican background and turns Roma into the model for one of her main characters. After Tali's death, Alfred offered a poignant literary reflection on his life and character in a short story called It Falls into Place, where, under the guise of the fictional poet Chrysostome, Alfred recapitulates Tali's biography and explores the mystery of his melancholy, of his remaining singlehood, and so forth. The story blends fact and fiction, suggesting that Tali's sorrow was rooted in unrequited love, possibly for a member of Alfred's own family, and in the broader sense of loss that pervaded his life and poetry. Alfred's perspective is both affectionate and critical. She knows the duality in Tali's poetry, the tension between the constraints of formality and flashes of genuine tropical heat. She also recognizes the depth of his suffering and the enduring beauty of his work. Alfred's writings on Tali does serve not only as a personal testimony, but also as a nuanced literary appraisal, contributing to the ongoing reassessment of Tali's place in Caribbean letters. Her choice of his most famous poem, L'Île Lointaine, can be seen as a recognition of how it exemplified his art, a celebration of the Antilles that also mourns their remoteness and the impossibility of return. Tali's formalism and attachment to French poetic models have been both a source of criticism and, more recently, of renewed appreciation. We find scholars such as Marie Lecronier-Witkowski argue that Tali's poetry, rather than being merely derivative or exotic, achieves a unique fusion of Western forms and Caribbean content, creating an intermediate space of creative hybridity. It's one proposal, or one very promising proposal for rereading his work. Perhaps the first step in a recognition that to return Tali to the Caribbean literary canon acknowledges the complexities of Caribbean identity, literature, and history in the early 20th century. From a celebrated poet of the Antilles to a figure marginalized by changing political and aesthetic priorities, I would argue that Tali's trajectory reflects the tensions of his time between colonial and post-colonial sensibilities, between nostalgia and modernity, between artistic aspiration and relevant social critique. But new literary approaches and cultural sensitivities may help us to find in his legacy, in his efforts as a cultural mediator and, most importantly, naturalist. He's helping documenting aspects of Kalinago language and Caribbean ornithology, spoke to his commitment to place and people. And his poetry, once dismissed as passé, now being translated and reassessed, can open a new path to understanding his contributions to Caribbean literary history and his nuanced engagement with colonial and post-colonial identities. So controversial is in his own day and after. Um, uh, I believe that that the poetry nonetheless endures, that it can be read anew, it can be read from a new perspective, in order to find for him a place as a precursor of some of the eco-critical literature we are seeing today. His lyricism, his deep engagement with place and memory, and his search for belonging continue to resonate among Caribbean writers. His relationship with Allfrey and through her with later generations of Caribbean writers further anchors his legacy in the evolving story of the West Indies. As hopefully new translations and critical studies would appear, I hope that Tali's work can be rediscovered, but not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a foundational voice in the literature of the Caribbean that can both illuminate both its beauty and its enduring contradictions. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Thank you for transporting us to Dominica and for those wonderful images of all that wonderful bird life and making that very compelling case for a reappraisal of Tali's work and contributions. So while people are gathering their thoughts on their questions, which again you can put in the chat or you can just raise your hand, I might kick off with one question, which is whether did he ever respond directly to the kind of critiques leveled at him by the writers of Negritude and Légitime Défense, or did he just not respond to those kind of accusations?
No, he never responded. He just sort of vanished, which is uh, both in character and surprising in terms of what a presence he was in Caribbean literary productivity at that time. But the critics essentially silenced him, and he never again wrote poetry. So essentially, he gave up. We don't know. I mean, Mark's work in recovering details. I mean, his introduction is perhaps one of the most significant contributions in understanding his life and the choices he made. But it is very elusive. With his disappearance, documents disappear. There is no archive. There are very few letters. It is very difficult to piece together the reasons for his lack of response, but there was nothing. There was no counter argument. There was no effort at defending himself. It is quite possible that he may not really have understood the issues that were being presented, or he may have. I suspect he may have found that they had some credibility or that he was not that kind of poet. But there was only silence, so all we're left with is speculation. Very tantalizing speculation. I would love to know. All we have is the poetry, but there's no poetry after
It's
the critiques.
It's fascinating, and it raises another question I had maybe about the archive. But I see that there's a hand up from Wilhelmina Joseph. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. I've until I saw this session advertised, I'd never heard of Tali, and I'm Dominican myself, but I was brought up in the UK. But I'm pretty convinced that I've never heard of him in any of my trips home either. What was it about Tali that actually attracted you to his poetry? I mean, somebody who has slipped into obscurity. What was it about him that attracted you to this beautiful thing that you've done in reintroducing him to us?
Well, first of all, it was the novel The Orchid House. I had I ran into the Orchid House once in London. I picked up a copy in one of those secondhand shops, and I saw the name that she quotes from The Distant Island, and I thought the verses were very beautiful, and that they echoed her own poetry, which is not that well known either. And then I realized that there was very little information about him. Books were out of print. I essentially had to ask a student who was doing research in France to go photocopy them for me at the Bibliothèque Nationale. I just grew very interested, particularly because he was the one poet that was writing about Dominica. And I had spent a lot of time in Dominica working on. I was working on a biography of Phyllis Allfrey, and and I would say that of the islands of the Caribbean, uh, only second, very close second to my home island, which is Puerto Rico, is Dominica. I just started thinking about that, and I also what resonated was Pauli's own effort to preserve the legacy of Dominica, thinking that well, nobody knows him. I mean, you're not the only one who doesn't know Tali. Tali is very unknown. And despite his popularity and his successes in the early 20th century, and I think it's particularly because of the lack of translation.
Yeah.
I mean, Dominica has moved to an English-speaking country throughout the last century and a half, and his poetry was written in French. So the idea with this project was to make a selection. I mean, this is only a selection, maybe I don't know, a tenth of his productivity. There are many poems, but some very complex approaches to love, to relationships, to longing, and so forth. And here we pick the ones that would be most relevant to Dominica and to Martinique. Just sort of thinking if there is a translation, if there is a bilingual edition, that then people in Dominica would actually rediscover him, right? And be able to access his work and become interested in tapping into the kinds of things or the descriptions of the forest. I mean, I can't believe that this man wrote so many poems about ants and bees. And I mean, the love for the most minute aspects of Dominican nature was really seducing.
This is what
Seductive.
attracts me as well. That's
Yeah.
being able to identify Dominica by just the few poems that you've showed us. I really look forward to reading the translations.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
I really do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, because that was the idea, right? And I don't know, we love the poems, and we thought they should be out there and give him another chance. I also it also resonated with me as an admirer of the negritude movement and all it has accomplished for the a re channeling of how we write literature and assess literature. I still felt that there were other aspects of his work that they did not understand him, right? That he was aiming at at a different kind of creativity. So it would be good to see how readers react to him now.
Sort of a poetic David Attenborough in a way. Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that leads very nicely into there's a question in the chat from Letitia Sen-Lubert, which is asking about translation. So she thanks you very much for the presentation and asks, could you tell us more about your experience of translating the poetry collection with Mark Andrews? Translating poetry is always a challenge. How did working on these poems together, à quatre mains, make the process more challenging or perhaps easier? And could you describe more concretely how you approach the translation in practice? For example, did you split the poems or did you work together on all of them? And says she really loved what you said about birds and found it very interesting that the diablotin, the bird you mentioned, is a related species to the Barrow's petrel from La Réunion. And thanks both translators and Papillot Press for publishing this edition. So a question about translation and how you work together with your co-translator, Mark Andrews.
Mark Andrews is a professor of French. I am not, and the collaboration worked really very well. We decided that we were not going to aim for rhymes and whatever, that they were going to be kind of more free verse, because we cannot do justice to the musicality of his poetry, which really it's lost in translation. It's really impossible to recreate. But what we did is that we divided that we picked the poems together. We selected them. Mark had and I had visited Dominica together when we took a group of students to Dominica many years ago, and he became very interested both on the island and in the island and the poetry of Tali. So what we ended up was actually choosing the poems that resonated the most with us, with our experiences in Dominica. I have spent a lot of time there, a lot of time going through the forest, looking for. I mean, the first time that I saw a Cicero in flight, I thought it was like that was it. I had reached heaven or whatever. But I spent a lot of time dealing with the ants and the insects and everything else, so that we were looking for those that resonated most with the two islands. In Martinique, looking for the poems on Saint Pierre particularly, but in Dominica, the poems about nature. We divided the poems. We just sort of split them. So I did the first draft of half of them, and Mark did the first draft of the other half, and then we switched. I think what he brought that I don't have was the very very exact knowledge of French and French grammar. I'm a native speaker of Spanish, so I mean, my French is okay, but it's not quite the and I brought with it my understanding of Korea. I mean, I'm Puerto Rican. I grew up in Puerto Rico. My understanding of Caribbean names for flowers, identification of things that were not necessarily in dictionaries, trees, flowers, animals, and so forth that were difficult to find in dictionaries. So, and looking for Caribbean equivalents of the term, right? What would resident of the Caribbean called this instead of the official name. So we worked together in preparing the drafts. He is very, very meticulous about maintaining the exact form and cadence of the verses when we cannot do the rhyme, but we worked well together. I was really very grateful for his attention to detail, for his sensitivity to the poem, but more than anything from his joining me as a kind of fan, right? We were turning it into more of a labor of love, so to speak. So, yeah.
Great. I guess, yes, I was thinking, and you've partially answered it already, but I'm assuming, this criticism that, he's a poet writing in French. But as you've just outlined, I'm presuming many of these words for the flora and fauna would not have been familiar to, let's say, a metropolitan French audience necessarily. And I guess you see that use of those specific Caribbean names for the flora, the fauna, describing what he sees around him as part of, maybe rooting him as a poet of the Caribbean much more than the negritude poets gave him credit for.
I think that I mean, I'm not quite sure. Um, I mean, this is one of those situations where I can actually see when you're looking at it through lenses, right? That you might look at the poetry that he was writing as not conforming to the new approaches, right? That he was not in the he had by the time the anti-colonial movement started. He was not particularly in tune with the new ideologies and whatever. He was not in France anymore. I think he made I don't know. He wasn't very political in his thinking and nature. So I don't know to what extent that world would have seemed alien to him. But on the other side, I can understand if you are uh, uh, looking for the colonial elements in your poetry, that you're not going to find them in him. So it's not that I think one is wrong and one is right. I think especially with a movement as central to literary and intellectual development in the Caribbean as the Negritude movement was. I think it was just a shift in misunderstanding, like shifts passing in the night, and I don't know whether one would have understood the other. But I don't. I think he's not writing after that. It's a recognition that he was not no longer perhaps relevant to that new movement, and that he would not be read in the same way. And But on the other hand, the I don't think people were reading him for what his poetry was offering, right? So they were reading him for what was not there, and perhaps not really recognizing the value of the other things that were there, because it was not the moment, right? It was not what I would call his environmentalism was way ahead of his time. But I think it was just they were working on different wavelengths. So yeah.
Thank you. There's a question here from Jeremy Peretz. Feel free to unmute. Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is so great. Incredible. And I can't wait to read the poems and the book.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question, I guess similarly about those not necessarily the eco-poetics, how you're saying that are maybe he wasn't appreciated in being sort of ahead of his time maybe, or but also thinking you mentioned his work um, with Kalinago people, with indigenous people, and I'm wondering, and as sort of ethnological, as you were explaining, and I'm wondering about that, and sort of how maybe also underappreciated, and if there's any, if that work or any of that writing is around, if it's been cited, like in any more recent, like secondary things, or um, how the kind of that research that he did might have played into the poetry, or beyond. I mean, along with thinking about the environment, like you're saying, and so I think that's a really fascinating part of it. So yeah, but this is so incredible. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the problems is that it's very hard to find archives in Dominica. The very climate and the insects, right? It's like you're looking at archives and you pull something out, and here come the cockroaches and things. The archive is being eaten away, and we don't know where that archive of Tali's work with the Kalinagos is. He was most particularly interested in language. He was particularly interested in putting together the traces of language that trying to understand where the language belonged and so forth. He I always attribute Phyllis Allfrey's deep interest in the Kalinago population to Daniel Tali's influence. I think that for her he was a model. Allfrey will have a very, very deep connection with the Kalinago people in Dominica and the Kalinago territory. She adopted two children from the two Kalinago children, which she raised, both of them still living. And I think that deep connection came from the work that Tali did, but that is lost. For example, we know that he was recognized for having, for example, for having cited a diablotin bird that I mean, it's the evidence of the bird not having been extinct for as he was believed to have been for years. That he was one of the first persons to do that, but that is only recorded because somebody quoted it in a scientific paper. Because nothing of this work of his on the Kalinago or on ornithology remains. So that is one of the sadness about the lack of archival collections I mean, it may be still around, so it might be worth looking. I have never seen anything, and Mark was indefatigable in searching for things, so I will ask him, and but we haven't seen anything, unfortunately. But the poetry remains, and what he has to say, he has very beautiful poems on the Kalinago people and their history. He has a beautiful, I mean, he was writing when the Kalinago were still referred to as Caribs, but he has a beautiful poem called Dominica, the Last Haunt of the Caribs, which is quite beautiful in its evocation of the people and their connection to the land and so forth. So what he writes about birds and their role, in the Dominican nature is all still in his poetry. So in some ways we can look at the poetry as an archive, but it is something is that nobody has studied this. So I think that would be a beautiful book on birds in Tali that I don't have time to write, but I invite anybody interested in this. These are magnificently beautiful birds. So I hope somebody does.
Thank you. Does he have any surviving descendants or family members in Dominica or spread?
There are some. There are some that Mark traced, and they got actually contributed some of the photographs to the that appear in the book, and I think I missed the launch in Dominica, but I understand from Polly that many of the relatives actually traveled to the island for the launch of the book, and I wish I had been there. Yeah.
I'm just scanning to see if there's more questions either in the chat or there was a hand up earlier from Sheila, but perhaps your question was already asked. But if you want to come back in, please raise your hand again. You had mentioned that he had both critical and popular acclaim in France, and that during his time in Toulouse and Paris, he was moving in French literary circles. Do you have a sense of, who he's conversing with in those circles? If he's influenced by any particular poets over there, or if his reputation outlasted him in France when he was, if he still maintained this critical and popular acclaim in France, even if the negritude writers in the Caribbean were kind of criticizing him.
Very little still unknown about who he spend time with. Most of what we know comes from the dedication of his poetry. So it's interesting to see who the poems are dedicated to. There were some important figures, actresses, some literary critics, and others that he dedicates poems to, and that sort of attest to his circle of friends, which seem to have been very varied, and in some cases very prominent. There were composers. I don't remember the name of the composer who wrote songs based on his poems. For example, if anybody's interested, I can send them I have the music, they can play it. And his famous actresses were reciting his poems at soirees and so forth. It seems pretty clear that he moved in some not exalted, but some important literary circles in both Toulouse and Paris. What motivated him to the Caribbean? It's hard to tell because of how little we know about his work. But the moment he stopped writing, he seems to have faded from popularity both in France and in the Caribbean, because there was no more material coming out. So his own lack of productivity or decision not to write poetry anymore essentially was a form of self-silencing himself, or self-silencing because of for whatever reasons we tend to attribute them all to the criticism, but we don't know. He may have had personal reasons, anything from depression to other things that may have contributed to the self-silencing him. But but the moment he stopped writing, he faded away, and there were no more inclusions in books and so forth.
Sheila, were you trying to come in with a question there, potentially? So you're trying to unmute. Yes, go for it. Go for it.
Sorry, I was trying to. I haven't used Zoom for so long that I couldn't remember how to put the hand on. I've actually, while you've been talking, I've emailed Polly Patello, so I shall. It's because I've been doing a talk on the geology of Dominica, and hearing you talk about how much he knew about the flora and fauna, I thought I've got to add that into my talk somehow or other. I never knew about him at all. It wasn't until Lennox Honeychurch said how influenced he was by him that I thought, how on earth did I not know about him? But yeah, thank you very much for all that information. It was really fascinating.
Thank you. To me, it's a source of astonishment that he is so unknown, right? In part because I read him for the first time, like 40 years ago, and to me, he's been a presence, right? But it's sort of only to me, it seems. But I think that the language issue has been crucial.
Since it's in French, yes, I agree.
Because it's in French, so
Yes.
access to the poems and editions. I don't know if, for example, Dominica has any copies of his work at the library. I doubt it. I doubt it. I know Phyllis Allfrey had his work in her library, but the books that she had were owned by her aunt.
Yes,
They were
and I
passed.
don't know what will have happened to a lot of the library since the actual library was severely damaged.
I think that the Lennox still has the Allfrey's books. Those are
Yes.
preserved. But I think that he really there is. I mean, I think of this collection is an invitation to reread him, but also an invitation to look at someone whose creativity was so focused on the very specificity. He writes about the mountains. I mean, there are poems to Morn Diablotan. There's poems to specific geological spaces. He recognizes I mean, for him, the shape of the island, right? The geological shape of the island is in and of itself a source of inspiration. So that what you see in him is this very acute observer of all things natural, right? Uh, the the birds, the ants, the bees. He was an avid beekeeper. So there are poems to beekeeping, there are poems to bees. The I love the poems on the solitaire because the cry is so haunting, right? And
Yes.
when
Yes.
you hear it, right? It's
It was a very haunting noise to hear in the forest. Yeah.
Yes, so I think that the acute observation of nature of the various elements, be it geological, botanical, ornithological, they're all there. They're all kind of like asking for a reassessment of the poetry. Is he the best poet ever? No, no. He had his limitations as a poet. I mean, there are better poets around, although he is very good, very, very good. But what I find is that as Jeremy mentioned earlier, an archive, right? I think that there is in this poetry both an archive of another way of looking at Dominica and a preoccupation with nature that we rarely find in a lot of writers, but also, I mean, a commitment to that nature, a kind of specific connection. He talks lovingly about his connection to Saint Pierre, but Saint Pierre is lost. It was the urban aspect of his Caribbean self, right? And now all he has is this sort of abundant and I mean, I don't know if you've never been to Dominica, the greens are greener than any place else. There are so many greens. Everything is, the ferns are enormous, everything is kind of proliferate nature.
I always say when once you have lived on an island, it's a poem by an American poet who lived on an island on the coast of Maine. If once you've lived on an island, you'll never be quite the same. And it's so very, very true. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention, Sheila. That was great. And there's a couple of things coming in the chat. So Samuel Battistoli asks and says it's fantastic. And if it's possible to share a link to the songs that were adapted from Tali's poetry with attendees, that would be lovely. If you do have such a link, you can obviously email it to myself or to Steve. And because when the recording of this session goes online, Steve kindly emails everyone to alert everyone who registered is alerted to the fact that the seminar's gone up. So in that same email, if there is a link or some way of accessing the songs.
Yes, I have PDFs of them. I can send them to you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried kind of tinkling around on the keyboard, but I'm not a great musician, so I would love to hear them. But they are. I mean, it's just a sign of how much he was valued in certain circles in Paris while he was there. That there was this collaboration with musicians that. And some of the work was actually performed at the Comédie Française, and it's all little pieces of evidence that attest to his popularity and reception in France at the time. But you know, the thank you, because you know the questions and comments mean that people are finding that their little snippets of poetry included interesting enough to you know look into him more closely. But he is clearly a poet of Dominica, and there would be. I mean, I would find nothing. Better than to have him sort of reinscribed in the literary history of the island, where he clearly is not now. So.
Well, there's a comment along those lines in the chat from Mervyn Caesar John, who says he was also born in Dominica and came to London in the 60s as a young, came to this UK in the 60s as a young girl. Thanks, Polly, very much for her work in introducing Dominican literature to the world, and looks forward to reading the book. And I hope there'll be an opportunity to expand on this at an in-person gathering in London. Will there be, is there an event, for example, at the Dominica High Commission? Maybe perhaps Polly might know about that if Polly wants to come in. In the meantime, Steve, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to say that if someone could tell us how we can obtain the book most easily,
Yes.
that will probably be useful. And I can also then circulate those details when I circulate and I would welcome the PDFs of which Lisa spoke, so that we can you know we can do this properly.
Can you come in? Yes, absolutely.
Just Steve, I thought I'd sent a message in the chat to say where the book can be bought. Is it not come up? No. Okay.
To Steve.
Well, I mean, you know, the usual suspects, your local bookshop, the dreaded online, or actually direct from me at Papillot Press. If you email info@papillotpress.co.uk. That's for, I'm afraid that's only for people in the UK, but otherwise, you know, worldwide, your online or your local bookshops. And Mervyn, if you're still there, maybe you and I could talk about the possibility of celebrating Daniel Talley's work and this book in the UK. That would be,
Absolutely.
That'd be fun.
That would be great.
And you posted that message directly to me, not to everybody, Polly.
Sorry, that's why it appeared just to you. Anyhow, I've now spoken on that issue. Then just the other curiosity about him being just not known in Dominica is that a Dominican friend of mine said she'd never ever heard of him. She teaches French at the convent high school in Dominica, and she said she'd never heard of Daniel Talley until she went to university in Guadeloupe, and he was on the syllabus there. So that's just a little curiosity to add to the story of Daniel Talley. And the families, the Dominican family to whom he's related to are the Bellots. So for Dominicans, they will know that name. And others, no doubt.
Thank you so much. So I just want to wrap up by thanking our very distinguished speaker again for such a wonderful talk. And thank you for your work along with Andrew and with Papillot Press for, this amazing work of preservation and reappraisal and reestablishment of Tallis to his rightful place within the Caribbean literary canon. I think you made an excellent case for that this evening. And just to everyone else, this is actually the last seminar in the UCL, the Institute of the Americas Caribbean Seminar Series for this academic year. But we will return in October, and we run seminars on all things Caribbean, historical, political, cultural, social, with a range of speakers. So if you're interested in tuning in 2026, 2027 academic year, keep an eye out for our emails and on the website of UCL Institute of the Americas. But in the meantime, just a virtual round of applause for our speaker, for the publisher, and to all of the audience for joining us and for all of your interventions. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Taking me back to my literary roots.